Hello, good morning.
Morning.
All right. So, it's just two of us. Y'all have gotten used to the fact that I'm sometimes a little late. I've been up running multi-level models and like I've tried to plot something. It's been plotting for 10 minutes. That is a frustrating thing about multi-level models is that they take a long time to run because it's their state is trying to, whatever the program is trying to consider a ton of information at once, okay, let's see. So not everybody's here, but that's all right. Do you have any questions, Matt or Stephen?
I don't think so as of now. No.
Okay. All right, excellent. Okay, so I thought I would just talk for a minute about some other causal inference methods. And I don't know if you've dealt with this a lot or what's the background of students and causal inference methods like instrumental variables and that kind of thing.
Yeah, like I think we go over instrumental variables, but beyond like applying them, I haven't come in contact with many individuals who've tried to do that.
Okay. Okay, good. In that case, I'll just treat it, a little bit, and just kind of give you a sense of the overview, at least so that you know what people are talking about when they say, well, I ran a difference in difference. Then at least you know kind of what it is. I have never run a difference in difference because my field is not policy. That is, it tends to be a policy type analysis to run. If we change such and such policy, what impact would it have on mass shootings or, that kind of thing. And so what they'll do is they model time series before the intervention, and then they model time series after the intervention. And the reason they do that is because time series is going to time series, so to speak. It's going to trend. It's going to trend with a bunch of other variables. As you know, there's a lot of autocorrelation. So stuff correlates with what just happened, that kind of thing. And so you have to take that into account to say, okay, so it was already trending up. And so you can't say, well, oh, it's trending up. Look at what this policy did, because it was already going to be trending up if you had no policy intervention. That's sort of the idea to look at. So you'll say, okay, so we've got some pre-intervention and there's variation. There's a trend. We call it in time series, the time series is integrated, and that means that it's trending. And so you see a trend, and then you say, okay, so is the trend continuing along the same pattern? And so you would see here, in essence, we would expect the trend to continue along the same rate. And what we see is a difference. And so what naive people might do is measure the difference between the two blue dots over here. And a more sophisticated thing to do is to estimate where that dot would have been if the intervention had not happened. Now, as with any analysis that we ever run, it's susceptible to other variables that happened at the time of the intervention or slightly after or slightly before that maybe we're not thinking of, so a lot of people, for instance, are running they're running with quarterly type data. So what was the economy doing before COVID? And then what is the economy doing now? So what are the labor trends? What is the unemployment? What is the labor saturation is one thing they look at. And it was tended to be going like this. And then you see COVID would drop it out. A lot of people lost their jobs and that kind of thing. And then over time, you see it drifting back up again. So what they have noted is a null finding, so to speak, with the difference in difference, because the labor trends are back on the line that they would have been. So if you imagine COVID at this blue line, and you've got an observed outcome, it bottoms out right here, and then it goes back up and it follows about what it should have done if COVID hadn't happened. Now, do we really know what would have happened if COVID hadn't happened? No, but we could see long-term trends and say, okay, it seems to be going along the same type trend. So there's a number of different things you can do with difference and difference. So instruments, I got a really good idea for how to understand instruments. And I almost should, no, I'm going to do this one. It's simpler. So about the time that Sesame Street, and y'all probably don't know about The Electric Company, is a show that I used to watch when I was a little kid. Many people were interested to know, is this having an effect on young students learning? Do they enter preschool knowing the difference between their letters? And so they'll look at differences on a 3 or 4-year-old test to see if watching Sesame Street makes the difference. And the trouble is that if they try to do some kind of intervention where they say, hey, hey, parents, you should really watch Sesame Street. There's 2 problems with that. They don't know if the Sesame Street actually was happening, and they can ask, which they did. But they also, the most important thing that they don't know is, would the parent have had the kid watch Sesame Street without the suggestion, right? And so they would look at, okay, did we encourage, and a random sample assignment, we encouraged half the parents to watch Sesame Street, and we said nothing to the other parents. Well, there's a lot of heterogeneity, because parents, instead of watching Sesame Street, might be reading with their kids instead, or something like that. And so it's hard to know what difference it makes. And so they want to know the difference between, if we encourage parents to allow their kids to watch Sesame Street, what difference would that encouragement make? And if you hearken back to day 1, time 0, when we started this class, one of the things that we might be most interested in as social scientists is, do policies make a difference? Is there something teachers can do? Is there something, schools can do? If they send out an email saying such and such, would it make a difference? And because at least we can do something about that. We can't do anything about the fact that low weight birth children read more poorly than regular weight children, even at age 4. There's big differences, and it's like we can't do anything about that. So the question is, could we make a difference now that the kid is 3 by encouraging the parent to allow the kid to watch Sesame Street? And of course, this study was done right after Sesame Street was started, which was like 67, something like that. In any case, we don't observe watching, but we assume that they're telling the truth. Yes, we did watch. We watched a lot, something like that, right? But to note the difference between, did they watch because of the intervention? What they do is they create an instrument by regressing the actual dependent variable that they wish they had, if they had perfect information, with encourage as a independent variable. Then you save y hat. Now it's watch only as a function of encourage. And you see how they've now sliced out the variation of parents who would have watched anyway, or whatever, right? That watching is now a function of whether they were encouraged, which is just a 0-1 variable. So now you have a y hat that is in some ways highly correlated with encourage, right? And it's also highly correlated with watch, but it's got that part out of it that messes with our understanding, that could, confound our estimates. And so now you regress whatever outcome that you're doing. You want to understand IQ or test results or ability to recognize letters, whatever the test is, and you use as the independent variable y hat. Now, the irritating things about instruments is that they often don't exist. And they don't exist because the instrument it has to be in this case, the instrument just exists. So let me give you an example where it doesn't exist. So here's a paper, and I often call, structural equation modeling that tries to model non-recursiveness. So X causes Y, which then causes X, and then X causes Y, which then causes X, and you've got non-recursiveness in your model, and you want to try to figure out which direction does the causality go. Okay, and I want to erase this for a second. So my data 1 paper was trying to understand why people respected the National High Court in their country. And I was looking only at Germans, and that included West Germans and East Germans. And at that time, they were a different country. At the time of the survey, it was a different country that hadn't reunified yet, or maybe they had just barely reunified, but the wall had come down, because if the wall is up, you don't interview East Germans, you don't have that data. So, and I suspected that the nature of the relationships between beliefs about what judges are doing, beliefs about what judges should be doing, has to do with the amount of time a person has been exposed to the court. And I thought it would be that way because there's a theory in political science in general, the running tally theory, right? And y'all know what the running tally theory is. Like, the Republicans are pissing me off, so I don't like them as much. Okay, I like them a little bit better. Okay, I like them less, and so like approval of a president, we kind of keep in mind, okay, I like that, I like that, I like that, I didn't like that, that kind of thing. Well, with courts, it's an asymmetric running tally. And it's the only one that we really know about that is asymmetric. And it's asymmetric in the following sense. At least until last year, it's asymmetric in the following sense. So you hear about a court case that you like, and that makes your estimation go up. You like the court more. And if you hear about a case that you don't like, you think, oh, they had to do it that way because that was the law, and it stays there. You hear about a case you like, it goes up. You hear a few cases that you don't like, it doesn't go down, And even Bush versus Gore, Democrats were found to forgive the court within 6 weeks, you know, which is a fast forgiveness rate, you know, because Democrats have not forgiven the US Supreme Court at all since Dobbs. Like they have just been, their respect for the court is just bottomed out. Republicans haven't liked the court, you know, the court. The ones who didn't aren't really going up. So the whole theory is just smashed to smithereens right now. But I suspected that the relationship would be different. And what I thought was that in early stages of a regime, the running tally will be more of a function of, do you like the people in the court and do you like what they've done lately? So I modeled a structural equation modeling, which is akin to two-stage least squares or something where that uses an instrument. And I say, okay, so I want to know, or do people perceive that the processes that the court follows matches what they want it to be? And so that was an index construction that was like, you know, I want the court to just follow democracy and not to follow the law. And that's my perception of what they do, then you get high. But if you want the court to follow the law and then they follow the law, you also like them just as much, regardless of which kind of process they're following. You see what I mean? Like, so that people are perceiving that the procedural expectations are being met by the court. And my thought was that in East Germany, your level of respect for the court is going to cause whether your expectations have been met. And this was at the time a conflict between a few people who studied procedural justice. Is it the fairness that causes people to like the court, or is it they like the court and then they deduce from that what the procedures are? And I suspected that it would definitely go in that direction for East Germany. And as you can see, I've got instruments here. I've got, so to speak, I've got instruments here. So specific support, I like what the court has done lately, is an instrument for diffuse support. And this variable has to be uncorrelated with I should say these two variables, specific support and legal alienation, have to be uncorrelated with the expectations met law or majority. And it happenstancically, I was able to find variables that were correlated with diffuse support that were not correlated with procedural fairness. And then I had to find two variables that were correlated with procedural fairness, but not with diffuse support. And judges should follow the law, not the majority, and they should follow their law, not their conscience. I use those as instruments. And instruments have to be exogenous to one instrument in a non-recursive model. One of the instruments has to be uncorrelated with one of the non-recursive elements, and the other instrument has to be uncorrelated with the other one. And it basically does what I just said. Structural equation modeling allows stuff to co-vary, and it's a little more complicated than just the save the y hat, but it makes diffuse support as a function of these two variables. And because that's the case, that now diffuse support is not a function of expectations met, because this variable is a function of these two instruments. And that's what's so frustrating about instrumental variable analysis, is you might not find anything that is a good instrument, that is completely exogenous to the recursive process that we're talking about. Matt?
Yeah, so I was wondering in terms of the instrument variable, do do papers typically go through the hassle of like trying to explain the correlation between the instrument and like DV, or do they typically just try to move past it by just giving like a theoretical explanation for why it should not be related and then just test it?
No, because it won't work.
Okay.
I mean, that's the bummer about this stuff, is that, I finally, my state of code finished running, but it won't estimate it, because, I mean, look, when Y is correlated with X, we don't know why, which portion of that correlation is due to Y causing X versus X causing Y. And if you don't know that, if you're just using OLS, it's just like OLS not being able to crack open that diamond that's in the middle. It can't crack it open. So the way you go about it is it must be empirically not a function of, they need to be strong predictor. The stronger they are, the top two elements here are a predictor of diffuse support, the better. And if it's correlated at 0.07, 0.12, that it's not going to have a problem. And the more instruments you have that are overall uncorrelated, the better. And so you might create an index for an instrument, or like I do, I just have two instruments. So you could have multiple instruments, and then their cumulative R square, if it was predicting the other variable, would be closer to 0. And even if a couple of the elements were slightly correlated, the cumulative, so it's sort of like a difference in the proportion of variation explained. If a bunch of variables that are here on top really have a big R square with diffuse support, then if it has a medium, small R square, then it's okay, and generally it's okay if it's atheoretical. It does not have to be, it can be a measurement model that one element of the measurement is correlated with one, but not the other, something like that. And it's another convention, basically, that if the model that you're trying to estimate has enough variation to work within and can separate those two parts out, then the model converges. But, one of the worst experiences of my life was sitting there while these structural equation models, you try to estimate it, doesn't work. You try to put in a different instrument, it takes all day, kind of thing. And so it's a really irritating process. But this is, and so I was able, if you see, I've got an arrow from diffuse support to procedural justice and another arrow from procedural justice to diffuse support. And the model converged, and it showed indeed that diffuse support has a bigger impact on procedural justice than the other way around. Okay. I guess I don't know if people still talk about Granger causality. Did you guys learn about Granger causality? So Granger causality is another one that if you have time series data, you can ask the question, does this cause this more than this causing this? And you basically regress the autocorrelations of the other variable and see what that looks like. And then you do the opposite. And so I'll give you an example. I have a paper that will never be published, unfortunately, because it's kind of cool, which was about the Supreme Court going public, like the president goes public. And our argument and our evidence showed that the Supreme Court causes what happens in the other institutions more than the other institutions causing what the Supreme Court is doing. So you would think Congress passes a law, it harms somebody, somebody litigates and brings the case to the court. But if you use, 10 lags, of what the Supreme Court is doing, and then 10 lags of the House, 10 lags of the president, 10 lags of the Senate. And we were able to sort of find that the most exogenous factor was the Supreme Court. And that's kind of I think, to me, I feel like that's a cool finding. And it's straight up empirical. It's not theoretical. It's like, we don't know. Let's let the model tell us which factor is most exogenous. And so that's kind of what this model is meant to do, is to test that. But there was no longitudinal variation here. So then it becomes much more difficult. And so that's what structural equation modeling is for. Grabbing out variation of diffuse support that would be uncorrelated with the other instrument, and then grabbing out estimates of procedural justice that are uncorrelated with the other instrument. And now you can regress them on each other and figure out which one is more likely to cause the other, given all the controls in the model. So anyway, it's kind of a cool thing. And then, oh man, let's see. Okay, now I've got the West German model. Over here. And what I suggested was the process is that people learn over time that the court should be legalistic and should not please people. And that makes people sort of socialized to not expecting to be pleased. So in this case, I said, I believe that the belief that judges should follow the law, not the majority, is going to cause diffuse support more than the other way around. And indeed, that's what I found here. And we have, a few instruments above here, and then a few instruments above there, and, various blah, blah, blah structural equations, which, probably what's reported has changed. This was published in 2001, so it's been a while. But in this case, it shows evidence of that running tally, that that beliefs about what judges should do is more likely to cause diffuse support over time than diffuse support causing the perception of the procedure. And that it tries to model a running tally with zero time variation. The best way to do it is to have some time variation. But that's an example of where instruments are really difficult to come by. There's a great example of an instrumental variable example in a great book called the causal inference mixtape, or causal inference the mixtape, by a econometrician named Scott Cunningham. And it's really a great book. And he wanted to understand the impact of meth use on CPS referrals. And it might have even been CPS removals, like foster care, stuff. Because in most states, just having meth in your system is child abuse. Before you ever find that the parent did anything wrong, it's automatically considered child abuse. Nevertheless, if you don't have data on the percent of the public that is using meth, right? Because they're not going to answer that on a survey, and it's a small percentage anyway. Then what he identified was a natural experiment when the FBI or DEA or somebody just cornered, they not cornered, but they confiscated a ton of meth, and suddenly the price went up, and suddenly people can't afford meth. And it took a while for the meth to be developed, such that the price came back down. And so they were able to kind of look at the street price of meth and this intervention that happened, it might be even considered sort of policy intervention. And what is the estimate of the impact on the reduction of foster care referrals? And then because they were able to use the instrument, that they were able to estimate that. But if you think about it, the price of meth cannot have an impact on foster care referrals or CPS referrals, except through reducing meth, right? It's logically it's a logical impossibility, right? Like there's no reason for it doing that except for through the black box of meth use. We don't have data on that, but they just sort of theoretically were willing to say, we believe that the only possible way is through this mediator. And so even though they didn't have any data on a mediator, they had a hypothesized mediator, and that was therefore their ability to estimate the causal effect. Isn't that cool? That's kind of a cool, genius way to think about it, in my mind. Oh yeah. Okay. So, and I think I'm done now. Am I? I can't see my outline anymore. I got rid of it. No. Slide sorter, no. Normal. There we go. Yeah. All right. So let's talk about multi-level models. Do y'all have any questions about the homework? There was a lot going on in there. So that's totally fine. If you want, you can send me the answers and I'll grade it, or we could talk about it another time, something like that. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit initially about the data structures. So let's talk about the various different data structures that we could think about. I wish I could move y'all. Maybe I'll just try to maybe to the side a little bit. So in multi-level models, there's just a bazillion kinds of multi-level models. Okay, so what you can have is individual panel data. So you've got people over time where you've got more than the 3 waves that sometimes surveys will do 3 waves where they interview the same people at 3 different time periods. To run a multi-level model, they have sort of what they call a 30-30 rule of thumb, that your nested units or more aggregated units should be about 30. And then the within number of units should be about 30. So if we were talking about the world values, we've got 90 countries or some number like that. You just need 30. So you could look at, the Western Hemisphere or the Southern Hemisphere, or you can select countries out like that, and that would be fine. But you can't run a multi-level model, not really, with just Canada and the United States, something like that. It's not enough. And the model won't converge. And for other reasons that you'll understand in a minute, it doesn't really work to do that. All right, so then you might have people across years. So one of the data sets that I'll make available to you, right now all I have it is a way to be opened in R, which is just fine. I've got some code in R to estimate it, is a data set in which they interviewed some kind of 3,000 Australian adolescents, and every 6 months contacted them to find out, do they smoke? Did they start smoking? Are they still smoking? And they have, in many cases, 6, 12, 10 time periods. So 3,000 times sort of 6 times periods, they've run a multi-level model with that. So even though that's not 30, they for some people, they fell out early. Some people have more units, and so aggregated over whole, they've got a good amount of units. But I can't think of very many examples of data sources that we would model that way. That where we have data that it extends over years or so many time periods, but in health data, they do that a lot, or education data. What is the reading scores, beginning of second grade, mid second grade, end of second grade, beginning of third grade, and then they'll just keep on, right? So that would be a case where we would have something like that. Oh, well, somehow I didn't put my slides in there for data sources. So the obvious data source that we would use is something like the world values data, where we have 90 countries with thousands of respondents within those countries. And, you could you could estimate a model for each country, but what do you lose if you do that? There's a couple of things that you would lose if you do that. First of all, it's a level of complexity, because you're estimating 90 parameters, and then you've got to also count in each independent variable. And now you've got 300 parameters, and it might be more parsimonious to think about fewer parameters. So that would be one way. And so then once you do that, then the data have standard errors that are clustered. And then they've got, other attributes of the data that might need to be taken into consideration that would allow a researcher to say, oh, I believe that support that like being a traditionalist or something makes you more likely to support political violence. And generally that's the case across countries, but there's different starting points for different countries, something like that, where where you're able to estimate the things all at once. And those things might be a function of whether the country is authoritarian, free, a democracy, something like that. And then you could model those slope coefficients that might change based on the country's characteristics. So that would be one form of data. One form of data is the one I'll talk about, where we have a survey within the United States, and we want to think about what county level factors are influencing the dependent variable in addition to individual level factors. Another data source that I put together is data that Michael Bird was working with, that was a study about people's attitudes about elections, voting rules, stuff like that. And it was administered to 18,000 people in the United States. And now you've got, chances are, a good number of counties with a good number of people inside those counties, or a good number of people even inside zip codes, at that level. And so you could actually look at zip code attributes and see if they can make a difference in those models. But here's an example of thinking contextually in a way that is not multi-level. And these are data from my students' senior honors thesis, who wanted to understand COVID deaths at the county level. Now, why can't you model COVID deaths with individual level data? Religiosity, support for Trump, something like that. How come you can't model that with individual level data?
Well, I guess wouldn't
Literally
it
a
be,
logical impossibility.
I would assume, like, if someone was trying to do that, you'd do more like a hazards model, where you try to like a more of a medical perspective, like how long it takes from someone getting COVID then dying versus like getting an aggregate result for for the results.
Okay, like if you had data on whether the person died or not, then you could model the characteristics of the person to see, were they more likely to die or not, kind of thing. But if you have an aggregate variable of COVID deaths, you, for instance, don't have a value for COVID death percentage, right? It's no such thing. So people do, as an aggregate, make up estimates that can happen at the county level. There can be how much did this county support Trump in the election? There could be, all kinds of racial segregation, residential segregation, policies that, had an impact. And you could model all of that. And if you had individual data and you were able to capitalize on that and say, okay, these people in my survey died, and I know that they died, which, political scientists don't often have data like that. Then you could estimate that. Now, what is the trouble with thinking about data at the county level, where you're trying to model, sort of, if you found a correlation, let's say, between percent Trump votes and death, in the county, what kinds of problems are there in making that inference? If I was trying to say, okay, counties that voted for Trump more had higher levels of COVID deaths, and that's because Republicans were not being careful, what issue comes up? Like, it has a name that I'm virtually 100% sure you've heard.
I'm blanking out on it, but
Okay, so it's the
yeah.
ecological fallacy. It's the ecological fallacy. And that's, so the classic example of that is that it turns out that a higher percentage of African Americans in a state is strongly associated with support that state gives to Republicans. And so a dumb inference would be, oh, well, that must be because the Black people in those states are supporting Republicans, right? That, and so that's where it becomes a dumb inference. There's also such a thing as individualistic fallacy. And I'm going to start teaching, it's a little bit of an arcane one. People don't usually make that mistake. But for reasons having to do with current events, I'm going to start talking about that in my American government class. The individualistic fallacy. And it's the opposite of the ecological fallacy. It turns it completely over on its head. You probably have not heard of that one, right? So the individualistic fallacy is, let's say you go to Longmont Police Department. Okay. Longmont Police Department is quite well known for being a fair police department. Like, it's one of the most progressive police departments in the country, if not the most progressive police department in the country. They quit trying to solve crime by arresting people in the 80s. Like, they've been at this for a long time and trying to build social capital, and they're trying to do all of this stuff. Okay. And they train their police officers, and they don't hire racist assholes to be police officers. I mean, they take all that stuff very seriously, and so you could go in to police departments and measure individual level attributes that might be actually quite progressive compared to police in any other city or town, right? And nevertheless, individuals in that, despite individuals, we're just pretending this is the case, that they have lower levels of unconscious bias, lower levels of outward bias, lower levels of aggression, lower levels of punitiveness, all of that stuff, because it's just been somebody at the helm has been trying to really work on creating a culture. And you could still have outcomes that are systemically racist. Now, how does that happen? Because this is something that irritates me about the way the pundits talk about police officers. Is they're like, well, wait a minute, that police officer is Black. How could they be racist, right? Like that's something that people say. And how is it that they could be racist? There's a couple mechanisms, but one of them is at the individual level where they've disavowed their Black identity. They think of themselves as white. And so they're not Black for all practical purposes. So that would be one way that would be at the individual level. But a great example of this is actually on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, when they started feeling guilty after George Floyd was killed, and they wanted to give some credence to the Black Lives Matter movement. And they have in there have y'all watched Brooklyn Nine-Nine? So they have in there, the main leader of the whole, group, the Mr. Straight Man, and he's talking with Terry, and they're having a conversation about whether they're going to go to the mat for punishing a racist act by a police officer in their realm or whatever. And I forget all their names, but the straight man, we'll call him, because he's gay, which is ironic, but in other words, he never cracks a smile or whatever. He wants to be police chief. And he's thinking, well, if I go to the mat to punish this police officer for this racist act, I'm going to get faulted when I try to go be police chief, right? And then Terry's sitting there and he wants to be promoted, and he's sitting there thinking, well, should I do that? Or am I willing to spend my political capital on challenging, this thing that happened, on punishing a cop or whatever? Am I going to spend my political capital? And they both decide it wasn't worth it. And so that's how you could have very highly well-meaning people who are, in a sense, committing an act that Black Lives Matter would disapprove of, which is not holding a police officer accountable. And they're doing so because of a variable at the system level, right? They're reacting to the temperature in the room or whatever, something like that. And so, and there's been some fun studies about, the way dialogue happens if you construct the room such that the mean is more centered, politically speaking, versus on the left and on the right. And as soon as you get the mean to kind of split over, you get outcomes that are way more extreme. And if you've got stuff in the mean, then the outcomes end up converging on the mean. And they do that despite individual level differences. And so juries would be another example of that kind of thing. Okay, so it's important to be aware of that, because in multi-level modeling, you're modeling stuff at the individual level, and you're modeling stuff at the aggregate level. And you can also aggregate individual level data to say, what is the mean of the income of these respondents, and model that at the aggregate level. And so there's multiple ways of getting aggregate level data. And so it's super important to be thinking about the individualistic and the ecological fallacy. Okay, so here's COVID deaths at the county level. And she was interested in county level political variables like vote for Trump, percent Republican, that stuff, and how that would interact with some variables that Raj Chetty, who I guess he has a Nature article that comes out every month, this guy at Harvard, who's using very good, well-crafted variables meant to describe sometimes not very well correlated variables that are different attributes of social capital at the county and now zip code level. And so, for instance, we have here these various social capital variables that she used. And Chetty talks about these variables called cohesiveness or bonding. And this is the tendency to be cliquish. It's a tendency to, I have my friends and we're all friends and we don't have other friends. And that's kind of what it measures. But at the county level, the tendency for friendships to be cliquish. And so they were measured from a couple of different variables, and clustering and support ratio are correlated at 0.5. So she created an index called bonding. Then there's a form of social capital called bridging. To what extent are people friends with people different from them? And this is sort of conceptualized or measured as the percent of friendships that poor people have with rich people. Like, to what extent are there friendships that cross socioeconomic classes? And that is called economic connectedness. And she calls that bridging social capital. And then there's linking social capital, which is the kind of social capital that links citizens to their city. Are they volunteering? Are they participating in civic organizations, number of civic organizations, that kind of thing. And these three things are not super highly correlated with one another. They're three distinct forms of social capital. Okay, so here's economic connectedness across counties in the United States. And it's kind of cool to look at that. The South, they do not have economic connectedness. Look at the Front Range is very high on economic connectedness. Where I'm from in New Mexico is down there is orange. You could probably look where you're from and see, like, where are you all from? Does this make sense to you, given what you're looking at?
I guess like by downtown Detroit area, so right
Okay,
at the border between like Wayne County and Macomb.
so here where it's kind of green
Red
right
and
here.
blue. Yeah, and green, yeah, there.
Yeah. So you're going to have a lot of rich people friends with a lot of poor people. And I wonder if that's because Detroit is such a high percentage Black, right? Where you have
Yeah.
the South, you've got segregation and, policies that impoverish Black people. And then they don't want to hang around Black people. And so you have less economic connectedness. It says something like that. Matt, where are you from?
Well, I just said Detroit, but Steven, I
Oh,
think
sorry. Yeah, Stephen. Sorry.
All right. So I'm from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Um, so that's like pretty much right where the little peninsula of Wisconsin sticks out to like Lake Michigan. And yeah, I'm not really surprised by how it looks.
What do you think causes the distinction here? The blue versus over here where you've got red. Racial homogeneity, maybe?
I wonder if there's like a norm, like structural norm for just like as you mentioned with the South being this like or not 100, but like the generations of having these kind of segregation has left a impact, and it just created a norm or like a norm that stayed with it after. So, but then I'm like looking at like California and around, I guess not San Francisco, but like the southern area, and it's also economic. It's like completely red. So I wonder if
Yeah.
there's like a bigger impact.
It'd be interesting to find out. And, Chetty finds that this variation, it strongly predicts economic mobility. And, probably for a whole slew of reasons, but, if you're poor, but you interact with people who are rich, you get ideas, you get resources, maybe get motivated, maybe you can see where things are, maybe people are more likely to help one another. Economic connectedness could be caused by things like the richer people are putting back into the community, and something like that. Some of it could be spurious, but nevertheless, that's one thing she looked at. And then she looks at excess COVID-19 mortality. Okay. And because COVID deaths are not really dichotomous in the sense of, might not be reported, first of all, we weren't getting data on whether they had COVID for a while, so that was causing, one thing. And then also, if you were super, super, super sick and you're kind of on your deathbed and you're in hospice and then you get COVID, is that a COVID death? Or were you were going to die anyway? And so the way they talk about it is excess mortality. Here's the mortality we would have expected, and then COVID hit and it caused this extra mortality. And remember, this is at the county level. So the units of analysis here are county. The cohesiveness of bonds really caused high levels of COVID deaths, probably because they're hanging around with one another. And, it could be all kinds of reasons. Economic connectedness brings COVID deaths down, but once you control for some of the other variables, it brings it up. Civic organizations participation brings it down. Same thing with volunteering, although the multiple regression is not significant. Income, the richer the county is, the less likely they are to die of COVID, probably because they're not breathing spewed out pollution everywhere. And, there's other things associated with that. And then economic inequality has a effect over and above the effect of income. Percent Trump, as you might guess, is positively correlated with COVID deaths. White people were less likely to die, and highly educated places were, much less likely at the bivariate, but you control for some of these things that explain why education might be down here. And it has a Simpson's paradox effect, changing the sign to be positive. So that's kind of an interesting thing, but you have to be, when you're doing this kind of analysis, you have to constantly be sure to force yourself to think that the effect here of Trump is not an effect that has to do with necessarily what Trump voters are doing. All right. So here she runs an interaction and finds that bridging capital increases the likelihood of Republican deaths, but not by much. But bridging social capital really brings down, to below zero. Ordinarily squares does all kind of weird things or whatever, but it brought the death rate to even lower, bridging social capital. And so that, that's something, but just always be thinking, okay, this is at the county level. And what do you think is going on there? Why did bridging social capital reduce deaths so much in Democratic counties as compared to increasing it in Republican counties? Anyway, you don't have to think about that for very long. And then here's another one where it's income at the county level, not at the individual level. And lower incomes have lower death rates, right? So are higher death rates. So you've got this blue line way up here. And economic connectedness brought that down very little, but if you had a high income, that economic connectedness really increased your likelihood of dying. And so that's another, sort of novel finding there. And then racial diversity, if you have low white population, economic connectedness brought deaths down. But if you have high white population, economic connectedness brought it up. So there's so now when we think contextually about individuals, the way those data structures look is they you have in the world value survey, you open it up and you've got 90,000 respondents or something like that, 86,000 respondents, and the country level variables are constant across every person within that country. So there's, I don't know, 80 or 150 country level variables that don't vary across individual within the country. And so, you got to imagine that there's all sorts of attributes that that is in my country that might be affecting the way I'm thinking about things, that also might be a function of who I am. So my undergraduate who found that people who live in low freedom countries are more likely to want freedom, and people living in high freedom countries are less likely to value freedom. And what is going on there? What is the individual level mechanism that causes a contextual effect like that, right? It's not what you would think. You would think, oh, we have freedom, we like freedom, and then authoritarians try to socialize their people to freedom is not a good thing, right? I remember having friends really strongly tell me that they wished that they lived in a country in which you were punished for not going to church. And the reason for that is they feel like they're not doing it on their own, or something like that. Or they wish that if you punished people, then people would go to church, and then we would live in a more religious country. People would have values, abortion, like that kind of thing. But it's also like you look out your window and you're like, I don't like what those people are doing. Maybe we should, like the ways that people use their freedom are to use meth and beat their kids, or yada, yada, right? If you don't have any freedom, then you're not looking around at that in your context, and that would be different. And so, and the world values data, I think they already put in it some regional variables as well that are across a region within the country. And so that would be a unit. So one thing to be aware of is that people are usually not aware of their contextual factors. There's not a single human being in the entire world who thinks the reason I don't value freedom is because I live in a high freedom country, I mean, people are not aware of their causes anyway. I don't know if that has occurred to you as you progress through your graduate education, that you're looking around, looking at these findings, and you're like, if this is doing the causing, people have no idea that it's doing the causing, I'm super angry today because I'm an optimist and I've been disappointed. And so optimists have further to go in being disappointed. And big thing that causes anger is violated expectations, right? So it's things like that. Okay, so here we have like people. So if you have support for the rule of law on support for Black Lives Matter, you've got like a little bitty slope here, And the way I like to think about causality at the contextual level is to think like, imagine, for instance, in these social capital variables, that people being cliquish in that county, They're all being cliquish in their home, you know, and they're sitting there in their home, and every different group is being cliquish. And that aggregate, everybody being cliquish, imagine it's in their chimney and it's producing smoke, you know, everywhere. And so now there's all this smoke around the county that people are breathing that could be positive smoke or negative smoke, but they're breathing the smoke, and it doesn't have anything to do with whether the person is cliquish. And so it's a really important thing to be aware of, that the contextual factor is sort of in the air. You know, it's a smoky factor that, you know, nobody is aware of what their level of economic connectedness was. You didn't know what your level was until you looked at the map just now, and Chetty just published this data. And so it's influencing us by, we're breathing the air around us, you know. And so I don't know if you could think about contextual factors that might be having an influence on you, that if you took a step back, you could think about that. I'll give you one. It's my sense, and I don't know this, and maybe you all can tell me this, that there's a culture among grad students to be cooperative. Like there's not a culture of, I'm not going to share my data. I'm not going to, you know, I'm not going to help you because we're going to be on the market at the same time, and I want to kind of shit on your chances. You don't have that, right?
I have not encountered that in CU. So
Yeah.
happy about that.
Do you suppose it exists in other departments?
I think, yeah, stereotypically, like Ivy Leagues, that's my assumption would be competition.
Yeah, like I don't know if this is the case anymore, but it used to, you know, back in the day, Columbia had a terrible reputation. And what caused that was a structural thing, which is what they did was they accept a bunch of people into their program, something like 50, and they give them all funding for 1 year. And then whoever's the best out of that class then gets funding the next several years or whatever, right? And you're constantly vying for funding to try to, you know, increase your chances of getting funding. So you can imagine that creates a competitive culture that actually does harm, you know? And so that would be an example of people not even necessarily being aware that they're going into a program that is going to cause this kind of competition. But my supposition is that it goes on to cause all kinds of harms even after people get their PhD. They've been socialized at a fragile young age of their graduate career to be cutthroat, you know? And so there could be structural factors. And I think what has caused it for us is some very strong leadership a long time ago among undergraduates to start MOPS, to help one another. There, you know, there was just a strong tendency, and we've sort of I think our grad program right before I started here won an award across the country for being one of the most supportive grad programs. And culture causes culture, for, you know, it's autocorrelated strongly, right? It would take a lot and some very strong destructive leaders to destroy that culture, which could be done, you know, but it's sort of a competitive person in a cooperative environment might quash their competitiveness tendencies, you know, and in a Columbia environment, it might be, you know, increased, right? And so your individual level factors are interacting with those contextual factors such that maybe conflict, you're competitive, but you're kind of conflict avoidant, and everybody seems to be so cooperative that it's sort of a learning about what the culture is, isn't it? You learn from one another. And if everybody's being a fucking asshole, some people will drop out, but some people will stay in and be more assholes, to others. And so, that's a way that it's not just that context has a linear relationship with individual factors, but interacts with those contextual factors. And that's something that you're able to model with multi-level modeling. And, in this case, by the way, this is a picture, this is fake data. This is a picture of what would be considered a random intercept model. And the word random is kind of irritating. Random means it's allowed to vary, so because the rest of the world uses random intercept, then I'll use it too. But basically, you can see these intercepts are varying, even though the slope by which the support for the rule of law causes Black Lives Matter to increase, the slopes are the same. And, so you've got some amount of variation in the dependent variable that is accounted for by the mean across everybody in each unit. Are y'all seeing how that is? And these people are still varying. The initial plot was plotted regardless of context. And then these multiple slopes, it decreases parsimony, but it only decreases parsimony by 2. You've already got one intercept, which is kind of the mean intercept there. And then you're allowed to sort of allow the other intercept to vary as much as it wants to. But instead of modeling county by county by county, we're modeling these slopes all at once. And if we modeled county by county by county with survey data, even with 18,000 respondents, you're going to have some counties that have 8 people in there. You're going to have other counties with 250 people in there. Harris County or something probably has 250 people. That's the county in Houston, and it's 1,300 square miles, and high population density. So a random sample survey is just going to grab a lot of those people. And when you've got high sample size, you've got more confidence in your slope and all that stuff. And you just might sample, some small county in Utah, you've got 3 people in there and some weird looking slope just because of the 3 people in there. So do you see how the multi-level model allows you to bring those people in? It allows you to estimate their same county level factors, but then it puts them in the model with everybody else. And then it kind of helps to reduce some of that craziness. You see that? All right. So, and here, I made this data up. We've got low economic connectedness, medium economic connectedness, and high economic connectedness. And high economic connectedness, I just sort of predicted there would be a higher starting point of support for Black Lives Matter. All right, here we have the slopes vary, but the intercepts don't. And this is a picture of slopes that is called fanning, because it kind of looks like a fan. You've got different slopes where they all start at the same spot, but they, will slope out. And so you might see a fanning slope like this in monthly second grader data, on reading capacity or something like that, where you've got, everybody in the second grade coalesces around a specific mean. and then differences in teacher quality or something like that, that varies at the, at a higher level than individuals, causes that slope to increase versus decrease. And so you would see that fanning, and you could estimate a model such that the intercept doesn't vary, but the slopes vary. That's usually not the case with our data. It's usually the case that what you'll find is if you've got a negative slope, you've got a higher intercept. And then if you've got a positive slope, you've got a lower intercept. And so those ones look more like that. And multi-level models allow you to account for those different slopes with, estimates at the county level. That this would be one where you would say, okay, people who go to Ivy League schools as a whole are competitive, so they enter with a mean level of tendency to be competitive, at the beginning of grad school. But the culture of the grad program over time could cause that competitiveness to become less versus more. And so if the x-axis is time, or exposure to, some particular intervention or something like that, then that as that changes, people's level of competitiveness might drop. And, so even though they started at a different level, but then if you include grad programs in every circumstance, then you're going to say, hey, wait a minute, people who have low competitiveness are attracted to CU Boulder for a reason. And so your lack of competitiveness is predicted by, either lower assholery on average or higher, niceness to one another, that the entire population starts at a higher level of competitiveness, often because you were selected into there, or, I can't even begin to imagine what country level estimates would be changing in terms of the slopes and the intercepts. But the slopes and the intercepts do vary from one another, depending on what variables you have in the model. And so those are basically the three forms of multi-level models. There's random intercepts, where the intercepts vary. There's random slopes, where the slopes vary. And then there's random slopes and intercepts. And as you start to estimate more things, and as you start to estimate, allow the slopes to change across these various values, you'll sit there all day waiting for your model to run, especially with world values data. We got 86,000 respondents. They're really trying to put a lot of information together, all right. So looking at some data structures. So I wanted to take a moment and just show you, because I've had a bunch of data open all day. And so this is the data structure for the electoral attitudes data set. And as you can see, we've got 18,000 respondents, in our rows. So we've got a lot of, and then they were asked Q8 and, Q3. And so I went in there for Michael and I created, because nobody wants to estimate Q3 as a function of Q17A or whatever. You want to know what your variables are, or else you're going to forget. And so I went in and created, fraud mult and parties influence too much. And I believe it's fair, or, and I labeled it all and made everything 1 to 0, so that you can start, estimating various. So there's like, do I have my 0 1s in there? Yeah, like I have this variable in there, trust Dems reps, which is basically partisan negative partisan affective polarization, how much Republicans hate Democrats, how much Democrats hate Republicans, and for independents, we just had how much they hate both parties involved in there. And so we kind of created this scale for that, and all of that stuff is on the y-axis. And so here we've got these variables, and then as you can see, we've got variables at the aggregate level. Now this variable, fract middle and Gini, you can guess what that is probably, right? Inequality. So some of these variables vary on the county, and some of them vary by zip code. So we have, in some cases, a similar variable, and where some stuff is just measured where such that it varies across county, and some stuff that it varies across zip code. So that, is a way to have the data in there. And so you've got, I think I've got all my zip code. Yes, we've got all this data that now varies by zip code. And so you've got all of these various variables, and like the zip code might not have been in there. We didn't have data on that one, or there's not enough people in that zip code, or something like that is happening. But we've all got all these variables, and they're indicated by blah, blah, blah zip, and so that's that form of multi-level model. Wait. Cancel. I don't want to lose my things. All right, so that's that. And better always save. And here's CCES data such that I've attached this is one of my merge things that didn't help. Another thing about multi-level modeling is that when you have to merge the variables yourself, it makes you unhappy. And the truth is there's 12,000, 30,000, I can't remember, zip codes in this country. Not all of them are, are going to be in a data set with 1,000 respondents. It's just going to randomly sample. And so you might have a ton of zip code data that you're not able to, bring to bear to any question because they just happen to not be in the data. And so then you have to go in, and if you merge these variables, you have to go in and erase the data if they weren't, if case ID is missing or something like that. All right. So another thing I did was I went in and I put in the short course set of files, I went in and added the world values data so you could get it more easily if you want to. And so now I've got world values data. And so their, variables are all like the QP and Q7 and, that kind of stuff. And then, as I always do, I go in and create, conf gov. So that means confidence in government. And so, then I made them all 0 to 1, and I've got variables like that. And then you start to go down here and you start to realize, okay, now they've added unemployment rate and land area per square miles and GDP per capita, as a constant, as a function of real dollars and Gini coefficients and stuff like that. And then multiple organizations have added their data, or world values added multiple organizations. So we've got Freedom House, and these ones are Freedom House, but then, polity, democracy overall. BTI does these estimates of rule of law and market structure and stuff like that. Population per capita, that stuff, CO2 emissions, look at all that. And VDEM makes these indices that are like polyarchy, liberal democracy, that stuff. And if I were you and I were using this data, I would use the some of the scaling techniques to say, okay, well, Freedom House isn't the best. People have their complaints about it. So let's put in multiple organizations' estimates of freedom. Let's put in multiple organizations' estimates of, is it a democracy? You know, that kind of thing. And so that way, your measure is less likely to have systematic error and is more likely to have random measurement error, you know, because they'll cancel each other out. Although they probably do influence each other, you know, check out each other's scales, check out it, you know, and so they have conferences, they talk to one another. And so there probably is something like that. And so that it doesn't necessarily get rid of any of that kind of bias. But as you can see, I mean, the number of measures that they've got here at the country level just goes on forever. You know, I didn't add any of that stuff. These were all added for me. You know, the media bias, you know, these kind of estimates. Now, sometimes the level of democracy is inseparable from the level of freedom. You know, I think the US went down in democracy, but didn't go down in freedom or something like that. And so there's sort of estimates about that. But the amount of violence that happens, the amount of transparency, the amount of corruption, all of that stuff exists on the country level. Okay, so let's look at one in R. Okay, so I've got the I don't know how y'all put up with R. It's so irritating to me. Where is my is it my template? I want to just view that smoke pub. So I think I do view. Is that what it's called? Smoke. There we go. So now we've got this. So this is like an ID variable. And that ID variable, as you can see, varies across these units. There's these, I wonder, can I make it bigger or? I do that. No, there's nothing I can do to make it bigger. So, and this data is also in the folder that you have, but you know, number one has 6 or 5 measures. And then as you continue down, you've got individuals who occupy multiple units because we've been collecting data over time. And so that is a multi-level model because individual dot time is a unit, but people are a level 2 unit. And whether you smoke is a function of who you are, your parents, do your parents smoke, those kinds of things. And so that would be constant across person. And then, you know, you hit the 7th grade and now peer pressure is entered into the equation. And so the estimate at time 6, you know, or time 4 or something like that is going to show the entire set of units moving up because that's when peer pressure starts or something like that. So, you know, that's another type of attribute that can vary. And so that's the one I was talking to you about imagining yourself being multiple units. You know, I was a particular the time period of grad school, I was different than I am now, you know, and some ways better, in some ways worse. I don't know, but time takes its toll in multiple ways, right? And so it's thinking about things from that perspective. All right, so it's like, I'm thinking for just a moment. Do you know the difference between wide data and long data? Have you ever heard of those terms? Data being
Yeah,
wide or long?
like the structure and how it's formatted for time.
Yes. So can you describe that?
Yeah, so like when I think of like wide data, typically is like variable plus the time, and then like long it would be like individuals, and then like I do survey data, I guess typically, and what I think of it is like individual is like a column ID, and then you have the column for the whatever time we're looking at, like year, and it's just this like massive long data that like continues on with like an individual, like number 1, 2001, number 1, 2002, and it goes down as a long. Then sometimes you have like
Do
formatted
you
in a wide
use
sense.
individual level longitudinal data like that? Do you have data like that?
Like I've seen one where like, for like example, like my Swiss data that I've used was like you would have the ID of an individual as like as the like a column, and then a year column, and for that individual throughout that time will be one of the formats. But then like it typically comes in like a wide format where I have to like reformat it so it's actually usable for time series.
Right, exactly. Okay, so now you're now, yeah, if you're trying to model the longitudinal data, you need each time period to be its own unit of analysis. In the Supreme Court data that we use, we have data that is where the unit of analysis is the case. And then the case has these attributes. It was a 6-3, it was in a liberal direction, and it has those kinds of attributes. But we also have long data where the units of analysis are justice dot case. And so Brown versus Board of Education is then 9 cases, for all participating judges. And then like in Brown, everybody voted in a liberal direction. But if you have a 6-3 case, 3 of those cases will be in a liberal direction and 6 of them will be in a conservative direction, something like that. And so when we make our data wide, then what you have to do is you have to say, okay, so I have this case, and then I have to have a variable for every judge, justice who's ever been on the court, and they just have missing data if they weren't on the court for that case. And then you could look at the estimates of, what judges did in those cases by making the data long. Is that clear to you, Stephen? Because it wouldn't have been clear to me this quickly, thinking about things from that perspective.
I think it'd be like easier for me to like see examples.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I was looking for. All right, so let's do that then. Oh, I know what has to happen. So first, let me open this one. So in this one, the units of analysis are neither what we just talked about. The units of analysis are the analysis that it can also be a multi-level model, but it's a form of multi-level model we haven't talked about yet. And that is that my units of analysis are year dot policy area. And so you could sort by year, but right now things are sorted by, these are all discrimination cases. And so you could have like a number of cases in discrimination. And then you have all of these variables that are associated with discrimination in 1950. Percent liberal, you know, how many were reversed, how many amici participated in that policy area for that year. So it wouldn't be the number of amici for the whole year. It's just the number of amici for that year. How many cases came from different circuits, where they came from, what's the percentage of amici that are liberal in that area, you know, and then it just, I spent some time recently geeking out over my Supreme Court data, which it just makes me so happy. I love this stuff. So, you know, did they, was a case in discrimination put on the front page of the New York Times 4 years ago? So I've got all these lags and all this stuff, right? And the units of analysis, as Matt says, time has to vary long wise, you know, but you can imagine you have, you know, this case all to be long, and what you have in 1971, you've got your different policy areas, you know, that go like this, and then the attribute would be still discrimination 1971, but you would see it distributed in a long fashion. So that's one way of thinking about units of analysis. I also have year 1946. So I put all the policy areas together, you know, collapse by each year, and then I've only got 46 to 2020. Only, I mean, my book was 46 to 95. Look at the wealth of data, and you know, in this, you know, what's the number of business parties that took place on the court at that year? Did they win? What percentage won? How many dissenting opinions were there? And those are attributes of the year. I have this idea to model whether the Supreme Court follows the publicist thermostat, just like people do. They see things getting liberal, they become more conservative, or vice versa. So you would model that by the year. You could also model that justice year, you know, is another way to model that. All right, so I also have, let's see, here I have case ID is a unit of analysis. So we've got like strings that say what case it is. I even think we have case name, which is kind of fun. Who the petitioner was, or which type of petitioner, in I think 300 or 600 categories or something like that. Did it come from a state? Was the state a participant? Were they the respondent? Were they the petitioner? You know, so all of this data at the level of case ID. That was the original data. So here's the actual data where I have a bunch of variables. Oh no, I already ran out of them. I don't know why I'm running out of them. Okay, so now let's look at justice data. Trying to see if this just isn't sorted, or yeah. It's incredibly complicated data to create. Okay, justice. So now you have case ID. No, this is still. Yeah, that's not justice data. I try to put the units of analysis in the title of the got it, and then I matched every single amicus brief that has ever been filed to the court to this data. This is so now we've got you can see 9 versions of the case ID 1946-001. And then you go across and you have who the justice is, and so then you can, when they voted with the majority, they voted in a liberal direction, which varies not by case any longer, but by justice case. And so, Reed voted in a liberal direction on this case, but Burton voted a conservative decision on this case. And, other stuff doesn't vary even by case at all. Like they're all in the economic regulation category in that one, and there are still some case level variables that I have in this data, and they just don't vary by justice, and then I have to create variables that indicate to me, which justice is in there, and then when I make it wide, so I have here, darn it. I'm not very organized. I thought I was so organized. Oh God, and then I put the first 10 amici, I added their names. So I made it amicus brief wide. And then like, if you can see that, like, that's special concurrence opinion, Frankfurt, did he write a special concurrence or did he not? And then those are all ones or zeros. And I have to create those kinds of variables for each justice, even for, it's got a bunch of missing data. And so you can tell that this data is, 62 megs, whereas, the original ones are not as big. All right. And I'm also going to show you the ways of looking at the data, just to be aware that we haven't stopped. I'm going to show them to you in this format so that you're able to see that as well. In fact, why don't I just well, okay, I probably had my reasons for thinking about this here. There's also multi-level models that are nested versus non-nested. So people are obviously nested within a country. You know, there's no people who were interviewed as a citizen of Sweden and also interviewed as a citizen of Iran. Everybody within Sweden was interviewed in Sweden, and you could have citizenship in other countries, but you don't have a bunch of respondents in Iran that are from Sweden, right? Policy area by year are non-nested multi-level models in which there's multiple policy areas per year and multiple years per policy area. And so so that would be considered non-nested. Now, what some people would do is they would consider non-nested, they would consider nesting the model by gender. So it would be all the data sources of Iran and separating men from women. And you can estimate, for instance, a multi-level model using CCES individual level data in which you estimate random slopes and intercepts based on racial categories or gender categories or something like that. Multi-level models are often used for experiments in which they block the experiment. I don't know if you know what that is, where, I really want to know whether this drug works for people with MTHFR genetic mutation and people with not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my population of MTHFR versus not, and I'm going to randomize within that. And that way you can use it as a moderator, because as you remember from yesterday's lecture, if you've got a variable that is not correlated with the treatment and is not correlated with the outcome variable, you could use it as a moderator, and you can multiply with abandon and not worry about messing up your, do not control for post-treatment, variables, and estimate the heterogeneous effects such that you've got, contextual effects of treatment versus not, and treatment dot MTHFR or treatment dot gender or something like that, where you would have variables that would vary based on your blocking variables. And because you're randomizing within MTHFR category versus not, your variable of treatment is uncorrelated by definition with MTHFR status. Do you see that? And that's called blocking. And so then you could estimate a multi-level model allowing intercepts as well as slopes to vary across those categories, would be a way of doing it. All right, is it time for a break?
We have 2 minutes.
Yeah, why don't we take a break and then we'll come back and continue. Well, I was going to try to run some models, but it takes so long to run these models.
Yeah.
I don't think we could run it during the lecture. So instead, I'll let you run some of the models, and I'm posting a lot of the code in Stata and R for your convenience. Whatever you're used to working in, you can look at it from there. So, okay, I'll see y'all in about an hour.
Yep. Vanessa, I'll be a little bit late. I have a therapy session at 1, so I'll come back for a little bit, like the second half of the class.
Oh, okay. Oh,
I'll
okay.
be right back.
That,
in a minute.
yeah, that's totally fine. All right. Okay, take care. See you in a little bit.